In the sweltering heat of Alabama, 1840, a sprawling plantation lay under the rigid control of one man. Wealth, power, and fear ruled every inch of land, shaping the lives of those who toiled beneath the sun and the lash. Within the grand mansion, secrets festered, alliances shifted in shadows, and the fragile balance of authority was maintained through terror. One act of betrayal would shatter that balance, forcing enslaved workers into an impossible role, instruments of punishment against the very woman whose desires had defied the master's will. This is a story of control, humiliation, and survival, where loyalty is tested, morality is compromised, and every soul feels the weight of tyranny. Witness the horrifying spectacle, the quiet acts of resistance, and the enduring legacy of fear that rippled through a world defined by absolute power. Every glance, every whisper, and every choice carries consequences. Step into the plantation, where power demanded obedience, cruelty became law, and humanity persisted in the shadows. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. The first light of dawn stretched across the Alabama horizon, painting the sprawling fields in a muted gold. The plantation lay like a kingdom carved from the earth, its boundaries marked by rows of cotton and corn, the tips of the stalks trembling in the early morning breeze. Dew clung to the leaves, shimmering in the fragile light, yet even this fragile beauty could not soften the harsh reality that governed every inch of the land. The mansion rose at the heart of the estate, imposing and austere, its white columns reflecting the sun but casting long, rigid shadows that seemed to grip the earth itself. Its walls held the weight of wealth and authority, but also a tension that could be felt in the very air, thick with unspoken rules and the inevitability of obedience. From the edge of the fields, a line of enslaved workers began their day, moving in measured, silent steps. The men carried hoes and spades, their fingers calloused and stained from years of labor. The women balanced baskets of seed or water on their heads, their movements precise from practice and necessity. Children, barely old enough to understand the full measure of their lives, trailed behind, carrying smaller tools or fetching water. There was no chatter, only the soft scrape of leather against soil, the occasional creak of a wheelbarrow, the quiet hum of the morning wind. Each movement was weighed by the unspoken knowledge that their every action was watched, judged, and ultimately controlled. The air carried more than the scent of earth and cotton. It held the tension of hierarchy, invisible yet palpable. The overseer emerged from the mansion's shadow, riding a horse that bore the gleam of authority. His eyes swept across the workers like a hawk circling prey, noting posture, diligence, and any hint of hesitation. A sharp crack of the whip, though unnecessary at this hour, could still puncture the calm, a reminder that each person here was bound to the land, bound to the whims of those who claimed dominion. Beyond the fields, the mansion itself seemed alive with quiet assertion. Windows glinted as servants moved inside, carrying out domestic tasks with precision born from repetition and fear. The sun climbed higher, illuminating the symmetrical gardens and gravel paths, but even beauty here was regimented. Nothing was accidental. Nothing could exist outside the order imposed by wealth and tradition. Each brick, each beam, each sweeping staircase was a testament to power, a power measured not in kindness or fairness, but in the ability to demand compliance and ensure it. The plantation breathed with the rhythm of labor and law, each cycle of day and night a rehearsal of control. Men and women bent to the soil not only because the crops required tending, but because failure carried consequences far heavier than the weight of tools in their hands. The cotton would not wait. The corn would not yield its bounty out of pity. Survival depended on endurance, and endurance was dictated by the plantation's hierarchy. Even the birds seemed cautious, flitting between rows of crops as though wary of the human discipline below. As the morning deepened, the workers continued their tasks, each one a cog in a mechanism far larger than themselves. The sun climbed toward midday, promising heat and exhaustion, and still the mansion loomed, a constant, unyielding presence over all who toiled beneath it. In this dawn, the plantation revealed itself not merely as land and home, but as a system of power, fear, and control, where every life was measured, monitored, and held in strict proportion to the authority above. Here, In the first quiet hours of 1840, the rhythm of labor and submission began anew, and the fields waited for the sun to rise fully, casting light over a world where freedom was invisible and obedience inescapable. The plantation owner moved through his estate with the air of a man who believed the world had been shaped for his command alone. Every step was deliberate, measured, as though the ground itself must acknowledge his presence. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the fields with the precision of a surveyor, noting the alignment of crops, the posture of the workers, and the slight unevenness of the soil. Each observation was a calculation, an assessment of efficiency, obedience, and the maintenance of power. He had inherited wealth, yes, but it was his vigilance, his insistence on control, that had turned mere inheritance into empire. In his mind, authority was not merely a convenience, it was the natural order. The land existed to produce, the labor existed to toil, and the family existed to reinforce his dominion. He saw himself as the fulcrum upon which the plantation balanced. Without his guidance, he believed, the estate would collapse into chaos, the crops would fail, the workers would falter. Obedience was not negotiable, and discipline was not cruel but necessary. He could not abide hesitation, defiance, or questioning, even in the quietest forms. Every glance, every posture, every whispered exchange was subject to scrutiny. The mansion reflected his worldview. Its walls were immaculate, its rooms organized with military precision, each item placed to convey order and wealth. Artifacts from distant cities hinted at sophistication, but they were also symbols of ownership, reminders that civilization itself was an extension of his control. Within this structure, the household staff moved with the same caution as those in the fields, their every action constrained by his invisible but omnipresent authority. To live here was to exist under constant surveillance, a subtle but unyielding reminder of the hierarchy that governed every interaction. He believed that his family, too, existed as part of the system he had created. His wife, his children, even distant relatives were pieces on the board, to be guided, corrected, or restrained to maintain the stability of his world. Personal desire was subordinate to duty, affection subordinate to hierarchy, and rebellion a concept that could not be tolerated. In his mind, absolute power was justified by the necessity of order. And yet, there was a shadow behind this control, a tension born of his own fears. For all his confidence, he was obsessed with appearances, with respect, and with the maintenance of dominance. Every slight, real or imagined, was a threat to the equilibrium he had constructed, a crack in the foundation of authority. It was this obsession, more than any external challenge, that would shape the events to come, for the plantation existed not merely as a landscape of wealth and labor, but as a stage for the assertion of power in its most uncompromising form. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the enslaved began their labor, bodies already worn from the previous day, yet driven by necessity and fear. The fields stretched endlessly, each row of cotton and corn demanding attention, each plant a reminder of the work that must never falter. The heat pressed down, even in the early hours, turning the soil into dust that clung to sweat-soaked skin. Hands blistered, backs ached, knees buckled under the relentless rhythm, and still the overseer's gaze never wavered. No misstep could go unnoticed, no hesitation forgiven. Among them moved Marcus, a man in his early 30s, whose quiet strength had earned the cautious respect of the others. His eyes, dark and wary, scanned the horizon constantly, alert for both the overseer and the subtle dangers that accompanied the fields. Nearby, Eliza carried a water bucket, her arms toned from years of lifting, her expression resigned yet vigilant. Each step was measured, each motion rehearsed to avoid drawing attention. Children too young to understand the full weight of their lives mirrored these movements, imitating the adults with a combination of obedience and instinctive caution. Food offered no comfort. The morning meal had been meager, a thin porridge that barely sufficed to fuel the labor ahead. Hunger gnawed at them, yet appetite was subordinate to survival. They ate quickly, silently, aware that even a glance toward the overseer could invite punishment. The fear was constant, internalized over years, shaping every action, every glance, every word. It was a fear that could not be spoken, only carried, folded into the rhythm of work, heavy as the sun on their backs. Names, faces, and relationships were remembered because they were lifelines. Marcus knew who would falter under pressure, who could be trusted in moments of discretion, who might endure an extra blow to protect another. Eliza carried stories in her eyes, whispered across fields when the overseer's back was turned. Together, they navigated a world in which every movement was scrutinized, every word potentially dangerous. The plantation itself was a silent enforcer. Trees provided no shelter, water offered no relief, and the earth itself demanded labor. In the distance, the mansion stood as a constant reminder of the hierarchy that governed all they did. The overseer moved through the rows with a quiet menace, a shadow of authority that made the midday sun seem softer than it truly was. Even in the brief pauses for water or rest, tension lingered. Every glance, every sigh, every hesitation was a potential signal of disobedience. Life under the whip was not only physical, it was psychological, an endless negotiation with fear. Marcus and Eliza understood this implicitly. They carried their roles with the weight of knowledge, the necessity of endurance, and the hope, however faint, that survival could outlast the cruelty imposed upon them. Inside the mansion, the morning unfolded with a rhythm entirely different from the fields, yet no less dictated by hierarchy and control. The kitchen was alive with activity, the scent of porridge and baking bread mingling with the acrid smoke of the hearth. Enslaved women moved with practiced precision, their hands skilled from years of repetition, their bodies carrying both the strength of labor and the weariness of subjugation. Every pot stirred, every loaf shaped, was a reminder that their work sustained the household, yet offered them no respite or recognition. Amid the clatter and heat, Sarah, the housekeeper, directed the others with a firm but quiet authority. Her position was precarious. She wielded influence over daily operations, yet she, too, was bound by rules she could never bend. Her eyes were always alert, reading not only the actions of the kitchen staff but the subtle expressions of the master's family. In her careful navigation of power and survival, she had learned that silence often spoke louder than words, and that discretion could protect lives, if only temporarily. Children moved among the women, some fetching water, some carrying firewood, their small hands accomplishing what seemed impossible. They were witnesses to a world that demanded obedience long before it demanded understanding. Their laughter was muted, cautious, a fragile thing that could not survive under the scrutiny of authority. In the shadows of the kitchen, whispers passed between them, coded messages of comfort and warning, learning that survival required both cunning and patience. Outside the kitchen, the grand halls of the mansion stood as monuments to wealth and control. The furniture gleamed, polished to a reflective perfection, yet it cast shadows over the lives of those who maintained it. Each rug, each chandelier, each carefully placed vase was a reminder of a world they were forced to serve, a world in which their labor enabled leisure and comfort for others, while leaving them vulnerable to the whims of power. Even within this controlled space, tensions simmered. Rivalries between enslaved women arose from proximity, necessity, and the unspoken hierarchies imposed by the household. Alliances formed quietly, often as survival mechanisms, while caution tempered every interaction. Secrets were currency. Knowledge of the master's moods, of the mistress's desires, even of the other enslaved people's missteps could be leveraged for safety, for favor, or merely for a reprieve from the harshest punishments. Every glance, every gesture carried weight. A slip of the hand, a wrong word, could ripple outward with consequences far greater than the moment itself. The kitchen, the halls, the corridors were all arenas of observation and restraint, where survival depended on reading the invisible currents of power. And yet, beneath the careful obedience and quiet calculation, small sparks of humanity persisted, muted laughter, shared stories, fleeting gestures of compassion. These fragile threads would intertwine in ways no one could predict, hinting at the drama and conflict that would soon erupt within the walls of the mansion. She moved through the mansion with the grace expected of her, her skirts brushing the polished floors, her gloved hands resting lightly on the banister, as if the weight of her existence could be balanced by outward appearances alone. Her beauty was undeniable, with high cheekbones, pale skin untouched by the sun, and eyes that held both intelligence and a quiet defiance. Yet behind that composure lay a restless dissatisfaction, a simmering awareness that her life, though gilded, was bound by expectations she neither shaped nor desired. From the moment of her marriage, she had understood the terms. Wealth, status, and social recognition came at the cost of autonomy. Her husband, a man of authority and unyielding temperament, measured love and loyalty in obedience, in submission, in outward displays of compliance. Her ambitions, subtle and private, had no place in the public life she was required to inhabit. She had been trained to smile at the correct moments, to host guests with charm, and to maintain the illusion of contentment while her own thoughts circled like birds against the cage of her circumstances. The morning light streaming through the mansion windows highlighted both the luxury she inhabited and the confinement it imposed. She watched the enslaved women moving through the halls, attending to their duties with disciplined efficiency, and felt a complex mixture of empathy, resentment, and envy. They too were trapped, yet in a different way, bound to labor and fear, lacking the veneer of social privilege that she possessed. She envied their freedom of action within the bounds of necessity, their ability to make small, immediate choices, however constrained. Her decisions were always deferred, weighed against propriety, gossip, and the judgments of a world that valued her as an ornament and a symbol, not as a person. Despite her outward compliance, there were fractures beneath the surface. She observed the plantation with sharp, calculating eyes, noting how the work was distributed, how her husband wielded authority, how the enslaved were made to bend to the rhythm of the estate. Her mind traced patterns and possibilities, imagining worlds beyond the plantation, possibilities that existed only in thought because the cost of pursuing them was too high. Ambition had taught her patience, but it had also taught her frustration, a quiet, gnawing tension that never left her. Even in her interactions with her husband, there was a constant negotiation, an unspoken awareness of power and restraint. A glance could carry meaning, a tone could carry weight, and every word was measured against the expectations of her station. In public, she played the part of the dutiful wife. In private, she navigated the complicated terrain of desire, fear, and ambition. Each day reinforced the boundaries of her existence, while deepening the sense that the life imposed upon her was not the life she wished to lead. And yet, beneath her careful composure, a subtle defiance lingered. It manifested in small ways, fleeting acts that expressed her will and her dissatisfaction. A momentary smile withheld, a question posed too sharply, a thought carried silently. These were the traces of a woman aware of her entrapment, yet unwilling to surrender entirely to it. The tension simmered beneath the polished surface of the mansion, setting the stage for conflicts that would reach far beyond the private confines of her thoughts, hinting at a drama that would soon spill into the lives of all who lived under the shadow of the plantation. The mansion seemed to hum with unspoken tension, a current that moved invisibly through the halls and kitchens, threading its way into the minds of those who lived under its roof. Whispers began, soft and cautious, carried in the spaces between chores, in the brief moments when the overseer's attention was elsewhere. They spoke of her, the mistress of the house, and of movements and glances that hinted at an intimacy that did not belong to her marriage. The words never left the lips fully. They hovered, half-formed, spoken in hushed tones or caught in the memory before they could reach anyone who might carry danger. Marcus noticed it first, a shift in the way the other men moved through the fields, their eyes flicking toward the mansion with attention that had nothing to do with the work at hand. Even the youngest children seemed to sense the change, their playful whispers tinged with caution, their steps lighter, more careful. Every gesture was measured. Every glance toward the mansion required calculation. They had learned long ago that survival depended not only on labor but on observation, on reading the smallest details, on knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. In the kitchen, Eliza carried water to the hearth, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting secrets to fall from the ceiling. The women moved with practiced discretion, hands and eyes busy while minds were occupied with quiet speculation. A door opened, a shadow crossed a hallway, and all attention snapped toward the sound, only to relax when it proved insignificant. The fear of being overheard or misinterpreted was constant, a weight heavier than the baskets they carried. They understood that a careless word, a misjudged glance, could lead to punishment. And in that world, punishment was never abstract. Even the household staff, accustomed to proximity with the mistress, felt the shift. Sarah, the housekeeper, had seen enough to sense a pattern, but she knew better than to confront it openly. Her experience had taught her that knowledge was power only when wielded with care. Rumors were a dangerous currency, yet they moved through the household like an invisible wind, touching everyone, influencing behavior, and shaping interactions. The mistress herself seemed aware of the undercurrent, yet she continued her routines with the same careful grace that had always defined her. She could not afford to betray unease, could not allow hints of indiscretion to ripple into the consciousness of those whose labor and obedience maintained her world. Her secrets were protected by her poise, by her station, and by the fear she inspired. The enslaved learned to navigate these currents, their silence a shield, their observation a weapon. Each day, they pieced together fragments of truth, building an understanding that was never complete, never safe to articulate. Every whispered speculation became a thread in the complex tapestry of survival, a careful balance of knowing and withholding, of seeing without being seen. In the shadows of the mansion, under the ever-watchful eyes of power, the tension grew, quiet but relentless, foreshadowing the drama that would soon erupt in ways none of them could ignore. The moment came without warning, yet it had been gathering like a storm on the horizon. The plantation owner had returned earlier than expected from a neighboring estate, the roads unusually quiet beneath the weight of midday Sunday. At first, he observed nothing amiss, the fields humming with labor, the mansion's windows reflecting the light with deceptive calm. But as he entered the house, a subtle misalignment in the air struck him. A glance too long, a hurried step, a shadow that lingered where it should not have, each a fragment that coalesced into undeniable truth. He paused in the doorway of the drawing room, his gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a man accustomed to command, seeking the confirmation he already suspected. There she was, his wife, caught in an intimacy that was not his own, her composure faltering for the briefest moment, before she masked it with the practiced grace he had trained her to maintain. Anger rose in him slowly at first, a simmering heat, then faster, a flame consuming all other thought. It was not merely betrayal he felt, it was humiliation. His authority had been questioned in the most personal, most unforgivable manner. He clenched his fists, noting the tightness of his jaw, the steadying of his breath, the controlled cadence of his heartbeat as he weighed his options. The law of the estate, the hierarchy he had cultivated, the labor and obedience of hundreds, all these factors merged in his mind into a single calculation. He would not confront this with idle words or impulsive violence. Such displays were beneath him. Punishment, to be effective, had to be deliberate, measured, and visible. It had to assert, beyond any doubt, the extent of his authority. His mind raced, not with confusion but with strategy. How to convey control, to restore order, to maintain fear, to ensure no other slight could ever go unpunished. The betrayal was personal, yes, but it was also a threat to the system he had built. If words spread, if whispers grew into assumption, the delicate balance of the plantation, the unquestioned obedience of the enslaved, the perception of dominance by peers, all would be undermined. He paced the room, eyes dark and calculating, each step a drumbeat of intent. His face betrayed nothing, yet beneath the composed exterior, a maelstrom of rage, humiliation, and cold determination churned. He imagined the tableau he would create, the lesson that would be carved into memory through both fear and spectacle. The punishment had to be complete, inescapable, undeniable. And in that moment, he understood fully that this was no longer a private matter. The plantation, the people, the hierarchy, all were now instruments in a performance of authority. The anticipation coiled in him like a viper, silent and lethal. Every detail, every move, every response had to be precise. The day's labor would continue, the fields would not pause, but when the moment came, he would make the lesson unforgettable. Power, he realized, demanded clarity, decisiveness, and a demonstration that no breach of obedience, no matter how intimate or concealed, would ever be tolerated. The stage was set, and the inevitable reckoning would leave no shadow of doubt in its wake. The air was thick with heat and tension as the plantation owner summoned those he intended to carry out his orders. The call came in the form of a quiet, deliberate knock, a summons that traveled through the hallways and across the fields, reaching the ears of Marcus, Eliza, and others who had long learned to read the signals of danger. Each knew immediately that the summons was no ordinary task, that the weight of authority behind it was absolute and non-negotiable. Marcus felt the chill of dread as he approached the mansion, the weight of the decision pressing on his shoulders before he even crossed the threshold. He had spent years navigating the harsh expectations of labor, of obedience, of survival, but this was unlike anything he had faced. To obey was necessary, a shield against punishment, yet obedience now carried a moral cost he could not easily bear. Every step toward the house seemed to echo with the gravity of what was to come, the invisible eyes of the owner measuring his compliance, judging his hesitation. Eliza followed close behind, her hands clenched at her sides, her mind a whirl of fear, anger, and uncertainty. She knew the whispered rumors, had felt the subtle shifts in the household. Yet the reality of confrontation was sharper, more terrifying, more immediate. The knowledge that she would be an instrument in a punishment imposed by a man who measured control as a birthright left her stomach knotted. Each thought of resistance collided with the certainty that refusal was not an option, that survival demanded participation, even in acts that violated the deepest currents of conscience. The group gathered in the shadow of the mansion, each avoiding the gaze of the other, each immersed in the private negotiation of fear and principle. Conversation was impossible. Words might betray thoughts that could not be revealed. Silence became a shared language, heavy and unspoken, binding them in a collective tension. Each person understood their role, yet each grappled with the moral weight it carried. The owner's plan had removed choice, but it had not removed conscience, and the friction between survival and morality created a palpable pressure that pressed down on them all. The plantation owner observed from the parlor, his expression calm, deliberate, yet filled with a latent menace that needed no articulation. He understood the inner conflict of those he summoned, knew it would twist them, bend them, and ultimately ensure their obedience. In his mind, the act was necessary to assert dominance, to eliminate any perception of weakness, to demonstrate that the rules of the plantation, and the hierarchy he controlled, were immutable. And yet, as the enslaved stood before him, silent, apprehensive, and aware of the impossible path laid before them, a subtle tension crackled in the air. Fear demanded compliance. Conscience demanded resistance. Each heartbeat was a negotiation, each breath a reminder that the forthcoming actions would leave marks not only on the one punished, but on all who were forced to witness and enforce. The stage was set, the players assembled, and the weight of what was about to unfold pressed down on every soul in the shadow of the mansion. The plantation's courtyard was silent, the usual sounds of labor stilled as the master emerged from the house. His presence alone demanded attention, the weight of authority bending the wills of those gathered. The enslaved stood clustered in the shade of the oaks, their eyes fixed on him, their posture rigid, hearts drumming with anticipation and dread. Inside the mansion, household staff paused mid-task, sensing the gravity of the moment, aware that the air itself carried a shift that could not be ignored. He spoke without preamble, his voice carrying across the courtyard, precise, deliberate, and absolute. He declared that his wife, the mistress of the house, had betrayed the sanctity of their marriage and that the consequences of her actions could not remain private. The words landed like stones, heavy and undeniable, rippling through those who heard them. Shock swept over the assembled crowd, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and horror, though none dared speak aloud. The hierarchy of the plantation rendered objections impossible. Silence was mandatory, obedience compulsory. The mistress herself stood rigid, her eyes wide, her breath caught between horror and disbelief. The polished composure she had maintained for so long threatened to crumble as the realization of what was to come settled over her. She understood the full extent of the power her husband wielded, the absolute authority he held not only over property and labor but over her very body. In the space of a single declaration, the entire social order of the plantation had realigned, and she was at its center, exposed and vulnerable. Among the enslaved, the announcement created a storm of internal conflict. Fear was immediate and visceral, for refusal to obey the orders that would follow could bring punishment, perhaps even death. Yet the orders themselves were repulsive, demanding participation in an act that violated the deepest codes of conscience. The tension pressed on every shoulder, every heartbeat, as they processed the impossible duality. Obey and survive. Resist and perish. Each face in the courtyard reflected the struggle to reconcile morality with necessity, the silent calculation of risk and duty that survival demanded. Even the household staff, those who had long been close to the mistress, felt a tremor of shock and revulsion. Their understanding of social norms, of propriety, of the rigid codes of the southern gentry, collided with the spectacle the master intended. In public, nothing could challenge his authority. In private, the judgment of conscience raged unchecked, a quiet rebellion in the mind that could find no expression. The courtyard, usually a space of routine and rhythm, became a theater of power, its boundaries defined by fear, hierarchy, and the inescapable rules of the plantation. Every movement, every glance, every suppressed gasp contributed to the growing tension. The master's words left no room for negotiation or dissent. The stage was set, the participants frozen in their roles, and the invisible weight of societal expectation pressed down upon all, making the impending punishment not just an act of personal revenge, but a demonstration of the unyielding structure of control, obedience, and dominance that defined the era. The morning sun bore down on the courtyard as the enslaved moved with mechanical precision, the weight of dread heavy in their chests. Marcus carried the wooden implements, his hands trembling despite the necessity of composure. Each step toward the designated space felt like a march into a nightmare. Every movement measured against the silent threat of punishment should hesitation show. The others followed, their faces taut with fear, eyes darting toward the mansion where the master watched with cold calculation. His presence felt even in absence. Eliza moved among them, distributing tools and arranging the space according to unspoken instructions. Her stomach churned with a mixture of revulsion and fear. Every plank placed, every cord measured, every item positioned for the punishment felt like a betrayal of something sacred. Whispered prayers passed from one to another, so low they could barely be heard over the rustle of cotton skirts and the scrape of bare feet on packed earth. They prayed for strength, for protection, for forgiveness, knowing that no God would answer their plea for exemption from the impossible task that had been imposed upon them. The courtyard had been cleared of its usual clutter, transformed into a stage for a spectacle none wished to witness. The enslaved moved with deliberate care, aware that each action would be observed, that the master expected perfection, that failure could bring violence upon themselves. The moral weight pressed down on them, heavier than the heat or the labor they had endured for years. To obey was survival. To resist was death. Yet to obey, in this instance, carried a cost that would not be erased from memory or conscience. Among the household staff, similar tension brewed. They moved silently, carrying out their roles with mechanical efficiency, though their minds churned with unease. Even those who had spent years accustomed to the rhythms of the plantation could not fully reconcile the orders with the knowledge of justice or decency. The mistress remained under watch, her eyes wide and haunted, understanding that every element being arranged was a step closer to her public humiliation, her vulnerability laid bare. The enslaved exchanged glances, subtle, fleeting, acknowledging the shared horror and the impossible choice before them. Each glance communicated the same unspoken truth. There was no escape, yet every heart protested. Every mind resisted in quiet rebellion. Their hands moved, their bodies complied, but their souls recoiled. The courtyard, prepared and silent, seemed to hold its own breath, waiting for the inevitable, for the moment when fear, obedience, and cruelty would collide in a public display that none would forget. As the final implements were set in place, as the boundaries of the space were marked and every detail checked, a heavy silence fell. It was a silence born of anticipation, dread, and the profound moral weight of forced complicity. They had prepared the stage, yet none felt ready, none could be ready. The moment approached, inexorable and merciless, and the enslaved stood on the threshold of a spectacle that would leave an indelible mark on every witness, visible or hidden, in both body and memory. She stood in the center of the courtyard, the weight of every gaze pressing upon her, the heat of the sun amplified by the intensity of her own shame. The mistress of the mansion, once adorned with the elegance and grace expected of her station, now felt the full gravity of exposure. Her hands trembled, not with the chill of cold, but with the heat of humiliation that coursed through her veins. The murmurs of the enslaved, the quiet compliance of those who had prepared the space, the stiff posture of household staff, all bore witness to her isolation, a cruel mirror of her transgression. Her eyes flicked toward the mansion, seeking some hint of mercy, some softening of authority, but the master's gaze met hers with a calm precision that offered none. His presence was a blade, invisible yet slicing through the facade she had maintained for so long. Every breath she took felt measured, every movement deliberate, for even the smallest misstep would be noted and punished further. The realization settled over her like a shroud. She was completely vulnerable, stripped of influence, and subject to a system that demanded spectacle over justice. Shame had never been so tangible. She felt it in the tightening of her chest, in the heat rushing to her face, in the tremor that betrayed her composure. The eyes upon her were not merely observing, they were recording, cataloging, understanding her as an object lesson in obedience, morality, and the limits of power. The enslaved watched with cautious fear, understanding that their own survival hinged on compliance. Yet she imagined their silent judgments, the weight of their knowledge pressing down on her. Even the household staff, who had once served alongside her with a semblance of camaraderie, now maintained a careful distance, their loyalty aligned with the hierarchy, not with compassion. Her mind raced through the implications of her actions, social expectation, personal desire, and the rigid strictures of patriarchy collided within her, leaving no room for excuse or reprieve. Every choice she had made, every moment of rebellion, had led inexorably to this public exposure, a punishment crafted not only to chastise but to assert the absolute authority of the man who commanded her life. The cruelty was systemic, embedded in law, custom, and wealth, and she was caught at its center, a reminder of the stakes of deviation from the prescribed path. As the minutes stretched, she felt the isolation deepen, a psychological void amplified by the sun and the crowd. No friend, no confidant, no shield existed between her and the spectacle awaiting her. She was utterly alone, suspended in a moment where morality, authority, and survival converged in their most brutal form. Each heartbeat echoed the inevitability of the punishment, each breath a reminder of the fragility of her position, and each blink of the eyes of those assembled was a needle of understanding, of judgment, of enforced witnessing. In that silence, she realized the full magnitude of power, the absolute hierarchy that defined the plantation, and the relentless cruelty of a system that demanded her exposure, her humiliation, and her compliance. Vulnerable and alone, she stood as both subject and symbol, a living testament to the consequences of transgression within a world defined by patriarchal law. The enslaved gathered in the courtyard, their movements deliberate, faces pale and taut with tension, each heart heavy with the burden imposed upon them. Marcus felt the weight of his role as if it were a physical yoke pressing on his shoulders. Every step he took toward the tools, every gesture of compliance, carried a moral cost that could not be measured, a debt that could not be repaid. To obey was survival. Yet the act demanded the surrender of conscience, a silent betrayal of empathy and humanity. Eliza's hands shook as she adjusted the implements, arranging them according to the precise instructions given. Her eyes flicked toward the mistress, and in that gaze she recognized not only fear, but a shared understanding of the cruelty at hand. A whisper passed between them, so soft it might have been carried away by the wind, a silent prayer that they would endure the day without succumbing to despair. Each of them carried a private torment, knowing that participation, even under compulsion, made them accomplices in a punishment that violated every instinct of decency. The courtyard, usually filled with the rhythms of labor, now seemed charged with a suffocating silence. Every leaf rustle, every shuffle of feet, sounded amplified against the stillness. They could hear the mistress' shallow breaths, the faint clink of the tools as they were adjusted, and in that quiet, the enormity of what was to come pressed upon them. Each enslaved individual wrestled with internal conflict, balancing fear of the master's wrath against the horror of the acts they were forced to commit. In their minds, fragments of memories flickered, moments of compassion, stolen laughter, shared burdens, and private kindnesses. Those memories clashed violently with the present reality, intensifying the psychological torment. To be ordered to act against someone they might feel empathy for, someone whose suffering they understood instinctively, was to experience a fracture of the soul, a compromise of the very essence of morality. Yet refusal was impossible. The consequences of defiance could be swift, brutal, and irreversible. As they prepared, each enslaved person became acutely aware of their own agency stripped away, replaced with the necessity to survive. The internal struggle was relentless, the need to obey warred with the knowledge of the moral violation they were enacting. They prayed silently, some to a God they hoped would grant mercy, others simply for strength to endure without breaking. Their burden was invisible to those outside the courtyard, unnoticed by the master whose satisfaction depended entirely on their obedience. The moral weight was compounded by anticipation, the knowledge that every action they were about to perform would be witnessed by others, recorded in memory, a testament to authority and fear. The enslaved were caught in a web they had not chosen, and yet within that web, empathy endured, raw and unbroken, a private rebellion against the cruelty they could not prevent. They moved with precision, with restraint, with a dignity that defied the master's design, though even their quiet humanity could not shield them from the knowledge of the acts to come. The mistress was brought to the center of the courtyard, the sun beating down on her shoulders, her dress clinging uncomfortably with sweat. Every eye was fixed upon her, the assembled enslaved and household staff alike frozen in tense observation. The courtyard had become a theater of fear and authority, the weight of expectation pressing upon every person present. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, a reflection of the terror that coursed through her veins, and yet she could not avert her gaze. The master's presence dominated the space, a silent command radiating from him, making the world contract around his will. The enslaved moved carefully, their motions precise but hesitant. Marcus held the tool with hands that trembled despite the necessity of control. Each step toward the mistress was a battle between obedience and conscience, the moral cost of the act clawing at him even as his body obeyed. Eliza followed, her eyes cast downward in a futile attempt to shield herself from the horror of her own compliance. Each movement, each placement of hands or instrument, was a quiet act of survival. But the emotional toll was visible in the tight set of their jaws, the taut lines of their shoulders, and the subtle shaking of their limbs. The mistress's voice, when it came, was barely audible, a fragile whisper that carried both fear and incredulity. She trembled, her hands clutching at her skirts, as though the fabric could shield her from the eyes that judged and the authority that dictated. The master watched with impassive calculation, measuring the impact of each gesture, each expression of terror and satisfaction settled behind his calm gaze. The power he wielded was absolute. Every movement, every reaction was evidence of control, a demonstration of the hierarchy that structured every aspect of the plantation. Gasps and stifled murmurs rippled through the crowd as the procedure began, the tension coiling tight within the space, pressing on lungs and hearts alike. The enslaved executed the actions required of them, their faces masks of concentration and concealed revulsion. Every strike, every adjustment, every enforced compliance was observed and internalized, the weight of participation pressing relentlessly upon them. In that moment, The intersection of fear, authority, and helplessness defined every body in the courtyard, uniting them in a shared experience of suffering and powerlessness. The air was thick with heat, dust, and the sharp tang of emotion, a mixture of horror, awe, and silent complicity. Time seemed suspended, each second dragging forward with relentless inevitability. The mistress's vulnerability was exposed fully, a living testament to the consequences of transgression and the cruelty embedded within patriarchal law. The spectators, both enslaved and free, bore witness in varying ways, some with empathy burning quietly, others with fear constraining every instinct. The punishment was no longer just an act of vengeance. It had become a demonstration of the plantation's structure, a spectacle that codified control and reminded all present of their place within its rigid hierarchy. The courtyard remained heavy with the aftermath of the punishment, an invisible weight pressing down on every figure present. The mistress stood trembling, her skin flushed and sweat-streaked, while her eyes darted from one witness to another, searching desperately for a fragment of sympathy, a glimmer of compassion. None came. The master's gaze remained steady and unyielding, a silent declaration that authority had been maintained, that his will was absolute. The enslaved, meanwhile, lingered in their positions, their bodies frozen in a tense limbo, hearts pounding with the combination of relief and lingering terror that accompanies survival when obedience has required moral compromise. Among them, Marcus felt his stomach twist with nausea and shame. The echoes of his hands' movements, the weight of each action performed in compliance, pressed on him relentlessly. He struggled to reconcile the need for survival with the conscience that screamed against participation in cruelty. His eyes avoided the mistress now, not from lack of concern but from the unbearable weight of complicity. He could feel the judgments of those around him, unspoken yet piercing, and the knowledge that every witness carried away a memory of what had transpired, etched into their consciousness. Eliza's chest felt constricted, her mind racing with fragmented images of the punishment. The mistress' wide eyes, the shivering limbs, the quiet murmurs of her companions. She could feel the ripples of fear moving outward, touching the children who had been brought to observe, who now clung silently to each other, wide-eyed and unnerving in their stillness. The young ones, too small to fully comprehend, sensed the tension, the injustice, the power wielded with merciless precision. Their innocence was invaded by the raw demonstration of control and hierarchy, leaving a mark on their understanding of authority that would linger long after the day ended. Even the household staff, those who had long managed the daily rhythms of the mansion, felt the tremor of unease pass through them. The lines of loyalty and survival were clear, but the psychological imprint of what had occurred could not be erased by familiarity or distance. They had watched the theater of authority unfold, the spectacle of punishment as both demonstration and deterrent, and though their obedience had kept them safe, the memory would settle like dust into the corners of their minds, invisible yet persistent. The enslaved exchanged furtive glances, recognizing the shared burden of what they had witnessed and what they had been forced to enact. A silent understanding passed among them, unspoken but palpable. Each carried the knowledge of their own moral injury, the private torment of being compelled to enforce cruelty against another. Whispered prayers passed between them, uttered under the breath or in the safety of averted gaze, for strength, for forgiveness, for endurance in a world that demanded compliance over conscience. The air itself seemed to tremble with the tension of the collective trauma. Dust rose from the trampled earth, mingling with the heat of midday and the residue of fear. The courtyard had become a crucible, a place where obedience, cruelty, and helplessness converged, leaving a mark on every soul present. Even as the master retreated to the shade of the mansion, his authority unquestioned and absolute, the echoes of suffering remained. The community of the plantation was bound together in fear, a silent covenant of control, moral compromise, and the unspoken knowledge that the spectacle they had witnessed was a warning, a lesson, and a wound that would not soon heal. In the days following the punishment, the plantation settled into its usual rhythms, yet beneath the surface, a tension lingered, subtle and unspoken. The enslaved moved through the fields and the mansion with the practiced efficiency that ensured survival. But in quiet corners, in the spaces between orders and chores, Small acts of defiance began to ripple like hidden currents. These were not acts of overt rebellion, for such gestures would be met with swift and brutal retribution. They were whispers of humanity, careful assertions of selfhood in a world that sought to strip it away. Marcus lingered at the edge of the cotton fields, pretending to adjust the rows while his mind wandered to the mistress, to the cruelty he had been forced to enact, and to the weight of authority that pressed down on all of them. Yet even as he bent over the plants, he found ways to assert a quiet agency, small gestures that could not be punished. He would leave a sprig of wildflower at the edge of the field, a tiny symbol of life persisting amidst the oppression. He whispered encouragement to children as they labored alongside him, words soft enough to be missed by overseers, offering them the reminder that they were more than the roles assigned to them. Eliza moved through the mansion with the same careful precision, yet she found ways to protect those under her charge, sharing a morsel of extra food with a child who would have gone hungry, slowing her work just enough to spare another from exhaustion. She whispered prayers over the sick, stroked a brow with gentle fingers when no one watched, small kindnesses that required courage and imagination. Each gesture was an assertion of her dignity, a way to reclaim a fragment of control in a system designed to deny it. These quiet rebellions were contagious, though subtle. Other enslaved individuals followed their lead in tiny ways, hiding tools that would make work slightly easier, teaching a child a skill that might one day mean freedom, murmuring words of comfort when fear threatened to overwhelm. Each act was a risk, yet the risk was measured against the imperative to retain a sense of self, to affirm that even under the most crushing weight of oppression, compassion could endure. In the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the mansion and the laborers gathered in small clusters, these quiet acts became a shared language, unspoken but understood. Stories circulated of kindnesses performed under the watchful eye of authority, of empathy maintained despite coercion, of human connection persisting where cruelty had been enforced. It was in these moments that the enslaved reclaimed a moral landscape that the master could not touch, a space where their hearts, minds, and spirits remained their own. The psychological impact was profound. Each act of silent resistance reinforced the boundaries between compliance and conscience, between survival and submission. Though the plantation demanded obedience, these private gestures allowed humanity to persist. They reminded the enslaved that cruelty could not fully extinguish dignity, that even in a world structured by fear and domination, they could still choose compassion, solidarity, and moral courage. In this quiet defiance, they preserved themselves, their relationships, and the knowledge that some part of them remained untouchable, beyond the reach of the master's control. The day after the punishment dawned heavy and quiet over the plantation, the air thick with residual tension that had settled like dust over every corner of the estate. The mistress moved through the halls of the mansion with a new awareness, her head lowered, her hands trembling as she touched the polished surfaces she had once taken for granted. Every glance from a servant or enslaved worker felt like an accusation, a silent reminder of the spectacle that had exposed her shame to the world. The echo of the courtyard, of the tools and the trembling hands that had enforced the punishment, lingered in her mind, and she could not escape it even in solitude. The master, meanwhile, carried himself with the same composed authority, yet beneath the measured movements and cold gaze, a flicker of something more volatile lingered. His satisfaction had been absolute, the assertion of power complete, but he could not ignore the subtle consequences that radiated outward from the event. The household, once orderly in its routines and hierarchies, now bore a tension that could not be smoothed over by commands alone. His wife's submission had been enforced, but her eyes, now careful and wary, carried a new wariness that unsettled him, a reminder that humiliation had lasting echoes even within the structures he controlled. Among the enslaved, the aftermath was more complex, layered with fear, guilt, and the quiet endurance that had always underpinned survival. Marcus felt the lingering weight of his own actions pressing on him as he moved through the fields. The memory of holding the tool, the image of the mistress's wide eyes, haunted him with relentless persistence. Each glance from a fellow enslaved person was loaded with unspoken understanding, acknowledgement of the moral compromise that had been forced upon them. No words could be shared, no complaints voiced, yet the shared experience created an invisible bond, a collective burden that both united and tormented them. Eliza carried a similar strain. In the kitchen, as she moved among the pots and fired the hearth, she could not escape the image of the mistress, trembling and vulnerable, nor the knowledge that their obedience had been demanded at such a profound cost. Every task she performed felt heavier, every step weighted with the memory of their complicity, yet she could find small solace in minor gestures of care, in the discreet ways she helped others endure the labor and indignities of the day. Even in silence, she preserved a moral interior, a private rebellion against the cruelty she could not openly challenge. Children, both the household staffs and the enslaved, absorbed the tension in ways that were nearly invisible. Their games were muted, their laughter scarce, replaced by caution and awareness. They sensed the fragility of the household order and the power dynamics that governed their lives, learning early that authority demanded submission and that compassion carried risks. The plantation itself seemed to have shifted, the rhythms of work and obedience now underscored by a new, uneasy awareness that authority could demand acts that fractured both body and spirit. By midday, the mansion and fields had resumed outward appearances of order, yet the invisible consequences were clear. Shame, fear, and moral compromise wove through the household like threads of smoke, shaping interactions, altering loyalties, and embedding a lasting tension. Every member of the plantation, whether enslaved or free, carried the imprint of the punishment forward, a quiet but relentless reminder that power could dictate not only action but conscience, and that the repercussions of public humiliation could reverberate far longer than the day itself. The plantation was quieter than usual, as dusk settled over the sprawling fields. Shadows stretched long across the courtyard, pooling in corners where surveillance faltered, offering brief sanctuary to those who dared to move without immediate oversight. Among the enslaved, a subtle tension had taken root, one born of the recent punishment and the lingering knowledge of what had been demanded of them. Eyes met in fleeting glances, conversations held in whispers just beyond the earshot of overseers or the master. The weight of complicity pressed upon them, yet it had also created an unusual solidarity, a fragile network of unspoken understanding and cautious alliance. Marcus moved carefully through the back rows of the cotton fields, his steps measured, ears attuned to the distant shuffle of others. He had learned that silence could be more powerful than words, that in the absence of speech, meaning could still pass between those who understood the dangers of disclosure. He caught the eye of Eliza near the edge of the orchard, and without a word, a subtle nod passed between them, a gesture loaded with significance. It was an acknowledgement of shared experience, of the moral burdens they carried, and of the unspoken desire to protect each other and those under their care from further cruelty. In the kitchen, whispers traveled through the rooms like smoke curling in the fading light. Small confidences were exchanged, carefully chosen to avoid detection, yet heavy with consequence. The enslaved spoke of the mistress, of her trembling compliance during the punishment, of the fear that still clung to her like a second skin. There was no malice in their observations, only a recognition of vulnerability and a shared understanding of the perils of the master's authority. In these conversations, the boundaries between duty and conscience blurred, and subtle plans began to take shape. Small acts of defiance that could be executed without discovery, but that preserved a measure of human dignity. Even the children, keen observers of patterns in the adult world, sensed the shifting undercurrents. They learned to notice where caution was required, where trust could be placed in fleeting moments, and how alliances could form in silence. In their play, they mimicked the careful negotiations of the adults, understanding intuitively that survival on the plantation demanded attentiveness and prudence, that loyalty could be both a shield and a danger. At night, the quarters became a space of quiet strategy. Small gatherings formed in shadowed corners where those willing to risk whispered planning, shared knowledge, and support. They exchanged warnings about the master's movements, offered guidance to the young and inexperienced, and cultivated a sense of collective resilience. The memory of the public punishment lingered, an invisible scar that informed every decision, every cautious interaction. These clandestine connections, fragile and tentative, were themselves acts of resistance, affirming the enslaved's humanity even as the structures of power sought to suppress it. Within the household, the mistress moved with an altered presence, her own fears intensifying as she recognized the subtle shifts among those who served her. She sensed alliances forming, the quiet solidarity that could not be fully controlled, and the implications of these hidden networks stirred a cautious anxiety in her. The master, unaware of the subtleties weaving through his estate, maintained his vigilance over the visible order, yet the shadows of whispered alliances and covert understanding grew stronger with each passing day. The plantation, outwardly unchanged, had transformed in ways invisible to authority. Secrets and shadows governed the rhythm of survival, the logic of compliance, and the unspoken assertion of humanity. In the silent corners and whispered exchanges, the enslaved preserved their moral integrity, navigating a treacherous world with careful ingenuity and the fragile threads of trust. The first light of dawn spilled over the plantation, illuminating the fields in a pale gold that masked the hard lines of labor awaiting the enslaved. The master walked through the mansion and down to the courtyard with a practiced air of authority, his boots clicking against the worn stones, a sound that signaled both order and the unrelenting weight of command. The day began as it always had, with the call to work, the careful distribution of tasks, and the quiet scrutiny of every movement. Yet beneath the surface, the events of the past weeks had left invisible marks, the residue of fear and shame that could not be fully erased by routine. The enslaved moved into the rhythm of the day with a mechanical precision born of necessity. They bent over the cotton, their hands bleeding and blistered, their muscles taut with the constant strain of backbreaking work. Each movement carried the memory of the punishment they had witnessed, the moral compromises they had been forced to make, and the knowledge that disobedience would not only be punished but could imperil those around them. The plantation's rhythm was relentless, a cycle of labor and surveillance, yet within it, subtle acts of resilience persisted. A glance shared, a brief gesture of care for a child, a whispered reassurance in the shadows, these were the small resistances that allowed life to endure even under the strictest oppression. In the mansion, the mistress moved through her household duties with a careful, measured pace. She maintained the appearance of composure, but every glance from a servant, every whispered conversation that brushed past her ears, reminded her of the spectacle she had endured and the fragile status she now occupied. Her husband's presence hovered over her constantly, a reminder of the limits of her autonomy and the consequences of defiance. She performed her tasks with precision, her hands steady but her mind restless, aware that her past actions had irrevocably altered the dynamics of the household. Children moved through the edges of these routines, learning the contours of obedience and caution. Their games were quiet, their laughter subdued, and their observations keen. They noted the tensions between authority and submission, the silent agreements and alliances forming among the enslaved, and the way fear could shape every interaction. Even in their youth, they were marked by the weight of what had occurred, the trauma woven into the daily cadence of work and surveillance. As the sun climbed higher, the plantation settled into its familiar pattern. Meals were prepared and distributed, the fields tended, the overseers patrolled with unyielding vigilance, and the master and mistress maintained appearances of absolute control. Yet the underlying tension persisted, a reminder that the plantation's order was built not only on labor but on fear, humiliation, and the constant assertion of power. Every interaction, every command, every act of compliance carried the imprint of past violence, shaping behavior, loyalty, and morale in ways subtle but profound. By evening, the rhythm of the plantation had reasserted itself. The enslaved returned to their quarters, exhausted but unbroken, carrying the memories of the day, the traces of fear, and the quiet persistence of resilience. The master retired to his study, satisfied that his authority remained unchallenged, while the mistress moved through her rooms, her reflection in the mirrors, a constant reminder of both vulnerability and endurance. The cycle would repeat, as it always had, and as it always would, with trauma and obedience passing silently from one generation to the next, woven into the very fabric of the land, the labor, and the lives it contained. The master moved through his plantation with a sense of invincibility, a conviction that authority and fear were enough to maintain absolute control. Each step, each gesture, seemed to reinforce the image of unassailable power. He watched the fields stretch endlessly before him, the enslaved bending and toiling under the sun, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of dominion. The tools in their hands, the rhythm of labor, the hushed movements of the quarters, all were extensions of his will, evidence that he had built a world in which disobedience could be anticipated, punished, and extinguished. Yet beneath this surface of certainty, subtle fissures began to form, invisible to the casual eye, but apparent to those attuned to the currents of human behavior. The enslaved, while outwardly compliant, carried within them the quiet remnants of trauma, moral compromise, and covert understanding that could not be fully suppressed. Their eyes met across fields in silent acknowledgement, gestures unobserved by the master but loaded with meaning, reminders that control was never absolute. Whispers traveled in the shadows, small acts of defiance performed in secrecy, and the machinery of obedience, though maintained, rested on foundations more fragile than the master cared to imagine. In the mansion, the mistress moved cautiously, a living reminder of the consequences of hubris. Her fear and shame, carefully concealed beneath measured composure, underscored the limits of authority. The master's knowledge that he could command obedience in moments of immediate consequence did not erase the longer-term vulnerabilities that emerged from resentment, fear, and human complexity. Each interaction, whether with a servant, an enslaved worker, or even a child, carried the potential for subtle disruption, a crack in the facade of control that his hubris had blinded him to. Even the most routine tasks of the plantation contained moral weight, small ethical tensions that accumulated over time. The master believed that power insulated him from consequence, that absolute authority exempted him from the cost of cruelty. Yet every act of enforcement, every public humiliation, every demand placed upon those he controlled, exacted a toll not only on the victim, but on the wielder of power as well. The satisfaction of dominance was accompanied by a quiet corrosion of conscience, a slow awareness that fear could compel obedience, but it could not manufacture loyalty, respect, or moral legitimacy. The enslaved recognized this vulnerability, even if the master did not. They understood the limits of his omnipotence, the ways in which his authority was contingent upon their compliance, the cracks in the structure of control that grew with each act of coerced labor and obedience. Their resilience, persistence, and capacity for moral judgment persisted in the shadows, quiet yet undeniable, and it served as both shield and warning. The edifice of tyranny could appear unassailable, but it rested always upon human frailty and complicity. As the sun dipped low and shadows lengthened across the fields, the master retired to his study, confident in the outward appearance of order, yet unaware of the subtle currents undermining his authority. The plantation hummed with the ongoing rhythm of labor and fear, yet within that rhythm, beneath the surface of control, the moral and psychological cost of tyranny continued to accumulate. Power, he believed, was unchallengeable, yet the cost of his hubris reached far beyond himself, shaping the lives, the hearts, and the minds of everyone bound to the land, marking the plantation with consequences that would endure long after his presence faded. The sun rose slowly over the Alabama plantation, casting long shadows across fields that had witnessed generations of toil, submission, and silent suffering. Life continued with the familiar rhythm of labor, oversight, and discipline, but the echoes of the past lingered in every corner. The memory of public punishment, the humiliation imposed upon the mistress, and the moral compromises demanded of the enslaved had left indelible marks. These marks were not merely physical or immediate. They had seeped into the soil, into the routines, into the very relationships that defined the plantation. Fear had become a currency as potent as cotton, a force that structured every action, every glance, every whispered word. The enslaved carried the burden of memory like an invisible chain, a legacy heavier than any iron collar. Children born into this world absorbed the lessons silently, learning which words could be spoken and which could bring retribution. They observed how authority operated, how submission protected the body but could not shield the heart, and how the smallest act of humanity, an unspoken gesture of care, a covert warning, A shared moment of understanding could preserve dignity amid oppression. They inherited more than land, more than labor. They inherited the invisible architecture of fear, a structure that dictated survival and constrained the moral imagination. In the mansion, the mistress moved with a measured caution that reflected the permanent imprint of shame. Her beauty and social status offered no real protection against the consequences of desire or the master's wrath. Every interaction was filtered through the knowledge of vulnerability, the awareness that power was absolute, and that mercy, if it came, was always conditional. The master maintained his outward authority, yet even he was shaped by the system he had perfected. His obsession with control had yielded obedience, but it had also fostered isolation, paranoia, and a distorted sense of morality that demanded cruelty as proof of power. The weight of dominion was heavier than any physical labor, and its consequences rippled outward, touching all who lived under his gaze. The plantation itself bore the scars of hierarchy, the imprint of enforced order that justified suffering in the name of property and pride. The fields, the quarters, the mansion, and the courtyard were all markers of status and control, each space a reminder of the consequences of transgression and the obligations of compliance. Over time, the repetition of fear and discipline became internalized, shaping behavior long before commands were spoken. Respect was often indistinguishable from terror, obedience from self-preservation. The moral cost of survival was quietly registered in eyes, posture, and tone, transmitting lessons from one generation to the next. Yet beneath the weight of cruelty and hierarchy, small traces of humanity persisted. Quiet acts of compassion, moments of solidarity, and the capacity for empathy endured despite oppression. The enslaved found ways to protect one another, to communicate hope in whispers, and to assert their dignity in ways that defied immediate control. These acts did not dismantle the plantation's power, but they preserved the essence of moral life in an environment designed to suppress it. Survival required this balance between submission and conscience, between fear and the assertion of self, between obedience and resistance. As the day ended and shadows lengthened once more, the plantation stood as a testament to the intertwined forces of power, fear, and resilience. The legacy of that singular event, the public punishment, the assertion of absolute authority, and the silent endurance of those compelled to enforce it, shaped the social fabric for years to come. It was a world in which cruelty and survival were inseparable, where humanity was both tested and preserved in small, defiant acts. The plantation was more than a place of labor. It was a living monument to the consequences of power exercised without restraint, and to the quiet, enduring courage of those who lived within its grasp.